let me run through what we're going to do and also just a couple of housekeeping things, and then we're going to get moving quickly because we really want to hear from our presenters tonight. So first and foremost, if you are not speaking, classic Zoom etiquette is please put yourself on mute. I think by this time, most people who've gone through Zoom meetings know that that's a really critical thing to do. So if you do that, we would really appreciate it. You might also want to switch to speaker view as opposed to gallery view when we're having the presentation. We think that that'll be a better experience for you. You can ask questions. We're expecting welcoming questions of our presenters tonight. You can ask a question anytime by putting it in the chat room. We also will be reserving time after the presentation and after what some small group work for questions live. So you'll have a couple of opportunities, but if you got a question, I'd say write it down, put it in the chat, get at it right away. That'll be good for everybody because then everybody can see it. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to hear a few words from Jay Williams. We're going to then introduce our wonderful presenters who are with us tonight: Anika Singh Limar from Yale Law School and Aaron Boggs, the Executive Director of the Open Communities Alliance. They will be making a presentation led by our very own Michael Watterson, who is our Senior Community Investment Officer at Hartford Foundation, and he will be leading that. We're going to go through that for 25, 30 minutes, something along those lines. Then we're going to split into small groups, which will happen automatically. You don't have to do anything, it'll just happen, where we will have a chance to discuss some of the issues that we've heard, some of the thoughts, and some of our own experiences. Then we'll come back together, have a time for some sharing at that point, and then we'll wrap up. We should be all done by 8:25 or so. So that's it. By the way, if you have any other questions about what's going on, you can put that in the chat room as well. And our people will be monitoring that, and certainly we'll try to get back to you. So with that as an introduction, that's plenty of time for me. Let's turn it over to Jay Williams, the president of Hartford Foundation. And I got to say, again, personally, I am always thrilled, Jay, that you are as attentive to those of us in the Catalyst Endowment Fund as you are. It is always a pleasure to have you here, and I always walk away from hearing you with some sense of inspiration. So thank you for being with us tonight, and take it away.
Terry, thank you for the gracious introduction, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to get to know you over the almost 4 years that my family and I have been here. And I want to welcome our special guests, Anika and Aaron, and all of the members of Catalyst, along with the staff of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. The Catalyst Giving Circle is our oldest and longest standing giving circle, and we are all appreciative of your generosity, of your philanthropic spirit, both in terms of your financial resources, your time, your talent, your intelligence. You all have been at the forefront of relevant issues in our region for a very long time. This current fight that we are in with respect to the foundation's commitment to dismantle structural racism and increase social and economic mobility is not new to any of you. And we certainly appreciate the fact that you have lent yourselves to this and various other issues that have been so incredibly important to members of our region, of our state, and have implications that reach far beyond the state of Connecticut. So again, for your foresight, for your willingness to lead by example is something that I and we are all appreciative of. That being said, we are, as the foundation, nearing our centennial anniversary. We were formed in 1925, and we are just 4 years away from the 100th year anniversary of this organization. The board of directors now and the board of directors in the past have always had a vision of this being an impactful, relevant organization. And it was clear to me when I started that the board was appreciative of the work that had been done in the 92 years prior, and had charged us with really leading into our work in new and different ways to really think about our place in this region. How would we remain relevant? How would we remain impactful, and make sure that we continue to engender the trust of our donors for so many years? So in that regard, a couple of years ago, as we had a listening session engaging all of the stakeholders, all of the categories of stakeholders in 29 communities that we serve, our donors, our community nonprofit partners, our friends and neighbors, our peers, to really talk about our direction moving forward. And through those conversations, through the absorption of data that spoke to the well-being and the quality of life in our community, it helped us really zero in on this current strategic plan, which always ties to our mission. Our mission is to put philanthropy into action to create lasting solutions that result in vibrant communities across the Hartford region, the greater Hartford region. But in doing that, there were data indicators that demonstrated to us that we would not be successful in trying to achieve that mission if we did not acknowledge and begin to figure out what is our place in addressing some of the very significant barriers that exist and plague folks in our region. And what the data demonstrated to us was that the quality of life, the aspirational attainment, the opportunities were adversely impacted by far too many factors in our communities of color, specifically around the issues of race, place, and income. So the race or ethnicity, the geographical location of where you lived, your socioeconomic demographics had a disproportionately adverse impact if you happen to be a member of a community of color. And as we thought about that, we thought about how do we stay true to our mission if we are being stared in the face by data that demonstrates that ultimately, no matter how hard people work, no matter as much as they do to improve the quality of life, their station in life, there were these other factors that were continuing to plague them and their families in future generations. And as we got into the strategic plan with the 100% support of our board, we really focused our efforts on trying to address those inequities and those disparities, knowing that these are systemic problems that require systemic solutions, but we have a role to play through our grant making, through our convening, through our public policy, through our capacity building, and all of that is being brought to bear on what we are now talking about. And again, we started this journey a couple of years ago. So the journey and the commitment hasn't changed, but how we've talked about it has changed and begun to be more clear to focus, where we now find ourselves at the center of dismantling structural racism, working to dismantle structural racism and increase that social and economic mobility. We can't do it alone. Our resources are inadequate for the task at hand, but through our partnerships, through all of the other tools that we have in our arsenal, we are absolutely committed to doing our part. So you've heard us hopefully talk about that. You'll hear more about that, but tonight, I'm excited about the presenters and the subject matter that they will talk about, because when we talk about the inequities and the disparities and the deleterious effects of structural racism, you can absolutely point to issues around housing. You know, having stable quality housing is so much at the center of all of the other aspects of our life. It is hard to have gainful employment if you don't know where you're going to lay your head, or if that is always in jeopardy, or there's always a threat. It is difficult to focus on the education of your children if you have them, if you're not knowing your housing stability and all the things that are important to that, your emotional health, your physical health, your mental health. All of those things are tied back, whether we know it or not, to the stability of housing. And it doesn't mean that stable housing automatically makes all those things better, or all those other issues go away. But it does mean when your housing circumstances are unstable, all those other things are impacted and affected. And here in Connecticut, there is a lot of activity around the zoning and a lot of activity around housing policy. And it's a good thing, because there are far too many barriers and far too many circumstances and situations where individuals and families, particularly in our communities of color, have been adversely and disproportionately affected by the zoning and the housing policies and the lack of stability and support in our region. So I'm excited. We're excited that we've got two individuals who are subject matter experts, who bring expertise and knowledge and experience, and to me, most importantly, commitment and passion around this issue, who are going to share with us this evening. And this is, again, consistent with where we are as a foundation. It's consistent where Catalyst has demonstrated itself as a leading partner with us. So by all means, I'm excited about hearing this and sharing and learning, using this as a platform to further launch us into our commitment around this area. So, Michael Watterson is going to do a wonderful job in moderating. But again, thank you for your leadership. And I turn this now back over to, is it either Terry or Betty Ann?
Actually, we're going to go straight to Michael. Thank you, Jay.
Good.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you, Terry. And I also want to say thank you to all of the members of Catalyst and any guests who are here with us this evening. And of course, a big, huge thank you to both Anika and Aaron for joining us as well. This is, as Jay has shared and Terry has mentioned, this is designed to really be an important and full conversation. But I want to suggest that we think of this for the next 25, 30 minutes or so as a family chat, because when it comes to really sort of leaning in and focusing in on these kinds of issues, at the end of the day, we really all are family. We all occupy the same community and really share the same aspirations for our community, for our family, and for our neighbors. So I want to invite all of you to really sort of sit back and feel absolutely comfortable to throw whatever questions you may have. And let's sort of really get into this. After we have spent a little bit of time chatting with our guests, we will reserve a little bit of time for some quick Q&A, and then we will move into small group breakout discussions. And then we'll come back a little bit after that to have some wrap-up conversation. So without any further ado, why don't we just get into our conversation with our two guests this evening, Aaron Boggs and Anika Singh Lamar. And if I can start things off just for a moment, Aaron and Anika, if you wouldn't mind, would you each of you just take a few minutes and share with us a little bit about sort of how and why you got into the work that you do around housing discrimination and access and all those kinds of things. Just sort of walk us through who you are and why you do what you do.
Anika, you want to start? Oh, I get to start. Okay, I'll start. It's really wonderful to be here, and I'm so glad that the Catalyst Fund is holding this event about an issue that is, very near and dear to my heart. I was inspired to do this work really by my parents and my experience growing up. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in something of a civil rights community. My parents had been part of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And my mother went on to be a DC public school teacher, and my father went on to work at an organization called the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, which he headed up for 47 years. You don't really see that anymore. And he would come home at night and tell stories about his clients. And one of my favorites was Alfred Mckenzie, who I really call his case was my father's first child. I was really the second child. Alfred Mckenzie was a Tuskegee airman who, after World War II, came back to Washington, D.C. and joined the government printing office, where he was again and again and again passed over for promotions. He was a Black man, passed over in favor of white men who he then trained to be his managers. And one night he got so fed up with this that he left work. He went straight to the Lawyers Committee. It was about 6:30 at night. The only person there was my dad. And they got talking, and my dad said, "We'll represent you. We'll take you on in a case against the government printing office." This was in 1971, and I was born later that year. And that case went on for 15 years. So it was they resolved that case when I was 15, but they resolved it in a really big way that meant that there was, all kinds of affirmative changes throughout the government printing office, and that case led to all kinds of agreements with other federal agencies. So that was in the water for me as a kid. Around the dinner table, and Michael is laughing a little bit because we just realized he happens to know my dad, worked with him in the past. And partly because of, I think, my parents' commitment to this issue, my siblings and I all went to these DC public schools. And that meant that my graduating class was about 87% kids of color. It was a tremendous experience to have access to a diverse educational setting, I could see the real value of that. And I think of it as a real opportunity. But I also saw a lot of disparities, both in just what was available to my, to me and my other schoolmates, but also big differences in what future possibilities were available for different friends of mine based on all kinds of things in their background and race and income and all of that. So that led me to be interested in this issue. I came up to Wesleyan for undergrad. I went back to DC for law school at Georgetown because you have to go to law school to be a civil rights lawyer, as it turns out. And met a guy from Connecticut, and so moved back here and worked at the ACLU, where I did representation of people who had been beaten up by police officers, people who had been, inappropriately imprisoned, and lots of other fair housing cases, and eventually worked at a law firm, worked at the Fair Housing Center, and in 2013 founded Open Communities Alliance to really fill a void in the housing and civil rights world here in Connecticut, for a group that was not getting funded by the state, and so could speak truth to power a little bit, and also could really try to pull together data, legal expertise, policy expertise, and organizing. So that's how I got here, and I'm excited to be here tonight.
So I realize during this retrospective that I'm now into about year 20 of career in housing and housing related issues. I initially became interested in really just as a teenager and as a college student, volunteering on homelessness issues, where I grew up on Long Island and then here in New Haven as a college student. And from homelessness became interested in how housing gets produced, and in thinking about how housing gets produced, inevitably kind of ended up in doing work over the years since I graduated from law school, both in the consumer protection area, in thinking about housing gives rise to the accumulation of wealth directly, as in terms of the equity in one's home, but can also, and we've seen way too much of this over the last decade or more, the last 15 years, lead to really dramatic losses in wealth when people are disfavored by the marketplace for a variety of reasons, the most prominent of which is race. And secondly, there's no way to really get interested in housing and then just not immediately see the segregation. And part of that is because it doesn't take long to see the ways in which housing is tied to every other resource to which we have access. And we all kind of know that. We kind of take it for granted. Location, location, location. What does it look for? What are you looking for when you look for a house? I grew up in a family where we moved from Queens to the kind of school district that gets advertised in the real estate listing on Long Island when I was 5, that magical age of 5 where people move to the suburbs. And as I got more, deeper into the work, it became much more transparent to me. All of these things from my childhood that I just had sort of taken for granted that as what people do are actually really incredibly nefarious things with extremely disparate systematic effects. So it's been at this point, I've been involved in the housing realm on the ground, working for a community development corporation, doing housing production as an attorney, representing housing developers, representing low-income tenants, representing low-income housing cooperatives. I've really run the gamut in terms of the kind of work that I've done, but the underpinning for me has been not just housing accessibility, but accessibility to the wealth accumulation and the resource access that comes with housing choice when people have choice, which is much too infrequent.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you both very much. So, Anika, you sort of alluded to the way the landscape has changed, perhaps, or has been impacted, at least over the last 15 years or so. And so I want to ask both of you, if you would, to just kind of set the stage for us for a moment and think about, given both of your obviously your expertise, your vantage point, think about where we are. We've come a long way over the years, but if you think about, say, back 15 or 20 years or so, what do you both think has been the most sort of transformative advance in the housing access and discrimination space to date, and why would you point to that? Just to kind of sort of level set for us the conversation. Where are we, and what's been in your opinion, the biggest sort of advance in the last 20 years? You may have to unmute, Aaron.
Yeah, I got to unmute. So actually, I have a few slides that I could show very quickly to sort of zero in on a few of the changes that we've seen. So I'll pop up my screen. And this will be very quick. But, there's quite a history here of evolution in the world of housing segregation and housing discrimination. So I won't go into that whole background, but since I've been doing this work in Connecticut, which has been about 20 years, the things that have really started to move the needle, I would say, are, on the one hand, research and data, and then on the other hand, some legal outcomes that have also kind of piloted some actual solutions that are working. So I imagine a lot of people who are a part of Catalyst, because clearly you are so hip, you must know about The Color of Law, which is a book I would highly recommend that discusses the way in which government was really in the driver's seat when it came to creating segregation. And I think that's a real cornerstone of how we approach this, because if government got us here, government really has to help us get out. And the other thing that we've been able to, I think, really leverage is all kinds of research similar to what Richard Rothstein did in The Color of Law that's local. So we've been able to work with author Susan Eaton. There's also some great research from Jack Doherty, who is a professor at Trinity College. This is a racial covenant that he dug up from West Hartford from 1940. He and his students, and the language that is concerning is no person of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or tenant. And I go to this a lot because I think it's very helpful for people to understand how real and intentional this was. And of course, the government role here was that these kinds of covenants were enforced by courts. So we also looked at research, and there's been research evolving over the last 50 years about how neighborhood matters. But the research that has really sort of hit home for people over the last 20 years, and this is even more recently, about 5 years ago, is by economist Raj Chedde, who's up at Harvard. He gained access to 10 million tax records for low-income families, half of whom moved to low poverty areas. And what he found when he tracked the outcomes for kids in those families who had moved was that if that move happened before the age of 13, the children had a greater chance of going to college and really high quality colleges. They had a 30% higher income. The girls were 26% less likely to become single parents. And in a companion study about public housing, when families from public housing moved to low poverty areas, the kids earned about $302,000 more over their lifetime. So what this tells us is that not that everyone should leave our cities. It tells us that neighborhood matters. So it's critical to be investing in our cities, but also critical to make sure that those choices that haven't been there before are there. The other thing that I think is a real evolution is our ability to convey the story of what's going on in regions. So we've had all kinds of mapping advances. This is a map by also Raj Chede's group, Opportunity Insights, called the Opportunity Atlas. It shows the Hartford region and poverty rates. So you can see what's going on very clearly and convey that information. There's mapping also by lots of other groups, but diversity data is another one at Brandeis. This shows where people are living based on opportunity designations for neighborhoods. And again, the Hartford region, you can see the purple dots indicate Hispanic kids. The yellow dots indicate Black kids. And you can see the difference in terms of the neighborhood amenities that are available. So again, we've been able to convey this to people. And we use mapping as well. We use opportunity mapping that we've developed, looking at education, employment, neighborhood characteristics, and we get maps that look like this. So you've got those dark orange areas that are places that are really thriving, the lightly shaded areas that need more investment, and then we can map that with race as well. So we can tell this story, we can make it really completely crystal clear what's going on. This is, again, the Hartford area. We've also been able to make this link again and again with segregation and the need for affordable housing. So we recently did a fair share study that looked at the need for affordable housing and discovered we're really missing about 135,000 units across the state. And we can allocate those out to towns and really set up a system where there's some goals where every town can take on its fair share of the region's need for affordable housing. We've also seen legal advances. There's been cases like Thompson versus HUD in Baltimore, which was about the demolition of public housing and where the families moved afterwards. And a similar case in Texas, Walker versus HUD, that also involved where housing authorities can operate. And those did a few things. They really pioneered opportunity mapping as something to help explain to judges and people more generally what the disparities are. It also, these programs also pioneered something called mobility counseling, which helps families with mobile vouchers get more information about neighborhoods they might not have considered before, which has been highly, highly effective. There's a long series of cases in New Jersey called the Mount Laurel series of cases, for lack of a better term, that really is doing in New Jersey what I just talked about with that housing need data, where towns in New Jersey have a number, they have a goal, and they are expected to meet their goal, and there's some enforcement that kicks in if they don't. So it's like we call it fair share zoning and planning has been pioneered there. And then lastly, the Inclusive Communities Project versus a Texas agency was about where subsidized housing is placed and the extent to which states and governments are pushing affordable housing, subsidized housing into only certain areas by and large, and that can be changed. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court and confirmed that you can basically use data to make out a fair housing case, which is very important as people have gotten sort of more sly about how they discriminate. And so that was a critical case, and that happened in 2015. So those are just a few what I think of as transformative advancements, and I bet that Anika also has some thoughts to share on that.
No, I think that was great. I am happy to sort of go back and forth on the questions. I endorse everything Erin just said.
Ditto. So Erin, you touched on something that I want to see if we can unpack a little bit more. So obviously, there's been some movement in a positive direction, but obviously, all of us know sort of intuitively there continues to be resistance to forward movement. what do you both sort of think of, I guess, that you would highlight as some of the primary obstacles today to our being able to really make headway in terms of eliminating racial bias from access to stable and affordable housing?
So I'll try taking that one first. You can think about these problems in a variety of buckets. So I kind of laugh because my students make fun of me for using that word a lot. Lawyers try to put things in categories and neat little boxes so that we can then address them one at a time. There is racial discrimination and segregative effect in housing, both in the private marketplace and from government. So you need to then address both of them. There is also a really sad aspect of housing discrimination and housing segregation, which is sort of hearts and minds, right? So it's individual demand by the primary segment of the housing marketplace, which is white home buyers, for white neighborhoods. So you've got at least three kind of buckets of problems to deal with. I think kind of zeroing in on the Hartford region a little bit, government is a massive barrier and problem. And the way that today manifests is through local zoning codes that make it incredibly difficult to build housing. And by various metrics, by studies out of Brookings, based on research by a colleague of mine at Yale Law School, Bob Alexson, who's sort of the dean of zoning research for the last 50 years across the country, Connecticut has the most restrictive zoning in the country. And that zoning gets implemented by 169 tiny little towns that have very parochial interests in inflating property values in their tiny little fiefdom. And we've had very little appetite from the state. We've had spurts of activity, but very little appetite from the state to really drill down and enforce the laws on the books that ought to operate to shut that down. And the problem in Connecticut is not that different from the problem you see in other parts of the coastal United States, California, New York, and the like, but it's particularly, I don't think people realize that we're the worst, right? I think that's an understood concept that we're number one on various areas of this stuff. And the reason is because of the tiny little towns. The tiny little towns create really parochial interests, and they also make it really, really hard, really, really easy, to white flight. So people talk about white flight as a noun. It is a verb, the white fleeing. And it's really easy to white flee when you can get to your job in downtown Hartford in 15 minutes from Simsbury, right? And you can escape to a completely different jurisdiction and can adopt rules that are exclusionary. Whereas if you're in a place where the jurisdictions are larger, it's harder to white flee. So you tend to, you see more segregation when you have tinier school districts and tinier towns. And that's what drives some of the desire when people talk about regionalization as a desegregation tool, that's what they're getting at. So in the primary obstacle to my mind in this part of the world is a legislature dominated by suburban legislators who, because their fiefdoms are so exclusionary, actually do not have to be responsive to the needs of poor people. They literally just don't. They don't represent any poor people, or they represent so few poor people that they literally can banish those issues from their mind and just focus on what I'm hearing in my community, which is a disproportionately white, disproportionately wealthy community. They have no accountability to what some of us might think are real problems because they don't represent any of those people. So the segregation and the disparate governmental resources that people experience just kind of mushroom and balloon on themselves. The problem begets more problem over time.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, I mean, I think there's also something I've seen in Connecticut over the last 20 years is an evolution that I think is continuing, even in philanthropy, because philanthropy is likely to be reflecting, especially for community foundations, communities. And so the more that there can be a growth and understanding of sort of the dynamics going on here for philanthropies, the more you can see change happen as well. I mean, I think part of the history here is you have this notion that you can drive by housing in the north end of Hartford that's really falling apart and see it and want to solve the problem. And the problem looks like it should be fixing up that particular housing development. And sometimes that's the right answer. Sometimes that's exactly the right answer. But when you look at, the Clay Arsenal neighborhood in the north end of Hartford, and you learn that 60% of the units in that neighborhood are subsidized by the government, when you have levels more like 1% or 2% in all the surrounding towns, that solution isn't always the right solution. And I think that's been part of our challenge as a state, is trying to think of how we can both make a difference for places that have been disinvested for a long time, but knowing that it's happening in a broader context of regions. I think of going canoeing with my sister when I was steering and she was paddling, and she didn't quite get that, for my paddling to work well, she had for my steering to work well, she had to paddle harder. So there's this notion of, if we can really start building more housing in a more diverse way, we're going to start to see a real difference for places like the north end of Hartford, with lots of investments too. Other things need to happen as well.
You both touched on history a little bit. And obviously history and culture are very intertwined and impact, shape, and guide the choices we make. Anika, you talked about white flight, for example, which is an active choice. I'm curious of what you all think about this, the notion that to some degree cultural values and sort of culturally influenced choices that we make ultimately figure into housing discrimination and into many of these other sectors, I think, that Jay alluded to earlier in terms of the intersectionality of this. What do you all think about that notion? How do you see cultural values and choices sort of figuring into this discussion around housing discrimination?
I see it really as something that should come back to choice, because people will make different choices based on potentially cultural values, potentially decisions about schools, potentially where their jobs are. And I'm thinking particularly of families we're working with in Hartford who are predominantly Black and Latino, lower income families. And there's a range of opinions. Some people will always want to live in the north end of Hartford, and there are sort of family and cultural reasons that they want to do that. But there are lots and lots of families, and based on surveys we've done, half maybe, who really want other choices. And that's the sort of heart of the matter, is the choices aren't there. So I think once we have the choices, then there'll be a chance for people to really exercise their interests in all these different issues. But the choices aren't there right now. And I think another aspect of this, when we're thinking about choice in our region, is how different our suburbs are. So we know that Bloomfield and Windsor and West Hartford are really different from Ellington or Coventry. And so different families want different choices, and because they're going to be comfortable in different kinds of places. And part of the point is to have those choices available.
I think there's another thing to think of. When we talk about, people tend to kind of problematize culture in low-income communities of color, but the most segregated communities in the country. I mean, Heather McKee has been saying this. I'm taking the line right out of from her book tour that's ongoing. The most community in the United States are white people, and that's very much by choice. There's tons of survey data when you ask white people where they want to live. They want to live with other white people, and even when they say they won't actually go out and look for it. Whereas you ask most people of color where they want to live, and they'll say they want to live in an integrated neighborhood. And oftentimes where they actually end up living is a function of what's available more than it is about wanting to self-segregate. White people actually want to self-segregate. So when we talk to them, we talk about kind of problematizing culture. The problem is not in this problem is not baked into low-income communities, it's baked into our white middle class. When you think about cultural values, there's a question in the chat about what's wrong with government subsidizing housing. Nothing. We stopped doing it for the part. In the World War II era, in the post-World War II era, there was sort of a national acknowledgement of a national housing crisis. The government put tons of money into housing, and not just housing production, like what we think of as big public housing, but also even where I live, giving property owners money to subdivide their houses into multiple units, right? Really like making it possible for more units to come online, both in the form of public housing and in the form of private development. And in the post-Nixon, Reagan era, we've disinvested from that. We've pretended like the problems with public housing are problems that were not created, where we've ignored the countries around the world have successful kind of social housing models. We have privatized affordable housing development for the most part, which is fine. I represent a lot of nonprofit developers that are building that housing, but it's just so much fewer units than what's necessary. On the demand side, which is Section 8 vouchers, only serves 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5, what research you look at, how they're income eligible for it. It's not a lottery system.
Yeah,
and most people lose lottery. So nothing wrong with they don't really, and our building problem is bad. We created a system where a lot of middle people with middle class families are housing cost burdened.
Anika, I'm going to cut you off just a minute because your audio is going in and out and it's hard to understand you. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm going to either hand it back to Aaron or Michael for the kind of final question before we go to some other Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I would add, and actually now that Anika's video isn't off, it might help the sound, but there's nothing wrong with subsidized housing. I think the problem with subsidized housing is when we decide to place it in a manner that generates poverty concentration. I think that is a government decision, and it's something that has happened again and again and again. I also think a better way to handle subsidized housing is really to do mixed income housing, because when you have groups of people who are disempowered because they're poor and they're all living together, what you end up with is a situation like the 3 buildings where we are working in the north end of Hartford, where it's hard to actually get the landlord to do what the landlord's supposed to do, and it's hard to get HUD to do what HUD is supposed to do.
Aaron, before we leave, could you say a quick word about open space preservation and how that figures into this this whole discussion as well?
So I am right now working with a nonprofit developer who's trying to do a development in Fairfield County, and found a beautiful piece of land in a town that desperately needs affordable housing. And the pushback that this developer is getting is from environmentalists. I mean, that's what the neighbors have come up with. Oh, this needs to be an environmental preservation. So we ran the numbers. We looked at the neighborhood and we assessed what percentage of this neighborhood and the next door, the neighboring neighborhood is really considered as one, is in environmental easement. 56% of the land in this area that has, 1.6% of housing units available as affordable to families is in environmental conservation. And, the problem is there's not enough land in conservation. So, on a personal level, my husband's family owns a farm in Colchester. It's almost 100% in environmental conservation, even though my mother-in-law has no retirement at all. There's a good reason to do environmental conservation, and it's important, and farms are important, and open space is important. But for too long, we've let the balance tip way, 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 way too far over, away from the desperate need that we have for affordable housing.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's worse than letting the balance tip, because it's also completely hypocritical. So, the best thing we can do for true open space preservation is to do dense housing development in resource-rich suburbs and towns near transit. 1 unit per 2 acre zoning, land, when you acres of land to house family. There's a transparent hypocrisy behind a lot of Connecticut's open space preservation. Sometimes people don't even mask it. The town of Orange just bought a country club where the facility only open to current members of the country club. The town's gonna lease the country club back to the country club. And the only reason to do that, to use public dollars to do that, is because you just don't want more housing.
Oh, wow.
So that's bad. So we're using public dollars, and our community foundations all put money into this stuff too. I've been on my high horse for the last year on the town of Surrey right now, purchasing a prop piece of land that have been slated for mixed income housing development. They've been couching that they're purchasing in racial justice because Martin Luther King Jr. worked there as a teenager. They claim that that's where he learned about integration, but that's not where he learned about integration. He learned about integration by going into Hartford on the weekends, because there was no integration in Simsbury, much less is there much right now, in a town that's about 2% Black. So these are really thinly veiled things, and they have incredibly deleterious impacts on people who have been shut out of the housing market for generations, who could maybe get into it now if we built at the same rate that we used to build at in the 50s, 60s, when the housing market was expressly closed off to people of color. So it's just important to note from a racial justice lens that we built a lot when the housing market was open only to white people, and we shut the doors, the zoning restrictions, the disinvestment in public housing, all happened right around the same time to the Fair Housing Act. So these things are not accidents. There's questions, what are the laws that led to this? There are effects. Exclusionary zoning really comes into being in the 60s, and it explodes in the coastal United States in the 70s. And that's exactly the time when you otherwise might have thought that African-American families might have been able to break into the housing market after, years and years and years and years and years of very explicit segregation policy.
So
Erin,
Erin,
I haven't read this book yet, but there is a great book out that I think gets at this right now, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. So that's just something, a book to consider.
So this has been a truly fascinating conversation, and if you had a chance to take a look at what's coming through the chat, there are tons and tons of questions, but I don't want us to run out of time. So what I'd like to ask is if perhaps we can maybe have you respond to maybe a couple of the questions in the chat, and then we'll move into our breakout sessions. So just lots and lots of really, really good questions. Is that okay, Betty Ann? Can we do that?
Yeah, that's fine. I might, a lot of the questions tee up a lot of what you've been talking about. There's one question about current legislation at the state capitol. Could one of you give us a very brief update on what's pending right now and whether we expect to see progress this session?
I'll talk about the two bills we're tracking most closely. One is 6611, which is a bill sponsored by Majority Leader Jason Rojas, which is the fair share bill, basically a bill that would ask each town in Connecticut to make a commitment to plan and zone for its fair share of affordable housing. It sort of honors that local control notion, except if towns don't do a good job, in which case there are some enforcement mechanisms. It's modeled off of the successful process in New Jersey, which has created hundreds and thousands of units of affordable housing. So that's one bill. The other is 6430, which is a housing authority jurisdiction expansion bill, which would allow housing authorities to operate within, I think it's at 30 miles of their jurisdictional borders in thriving communities. And this is to counteract the current law, which limits housing authorities to where they can operate, which means you have big housing authorities like Hartford serving almost entirely Black and Latino families, and they can't do anything outside of Hartford in terms of building housing, placing project-based rental assistance, and they have a financial disincentive if they let families they're working with who have mobile vouchers know about other housing opportunities in the region. And Anika, there may be some others you want to talk through.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of housing related stuff this session. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm going to turn my video off just in case.
Okay.
That's better.
There is, sorry. There is the SB 1024, which is the desegregate bill, came out of committee the same day as 6611, the fair share zoning bill, but much of the meat of it removed. It is now basically an ADU bill, which is great. These are good. They're not a solution to fair housing problems. In fact,
those are accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, sorry.
Apartments. Sorry.
Basically, yeah, that's okay. You basically allow a single family homeowner to add an apartment house. They're exempt from the Fair Housing Act if either unit is owner occupied. So they're not a solve on the fair housing side, but potentially helpful to homeowners looking to bring in additional income or to renters looking for housing in towns that don't really have a lot of rental housing right now. And that's a number of states have taken, but it's a lot less than I think what people were hoping for in that bill. There's also a right to counsel bill that came out of the Housing Committee that would give tenants a right to attorneys in housing court, which is huge and potentially could have a massive impact. New York City adopted right to counsel a couple of years ago. The incentives for them to do it are a little different than what exists in Connecticut because New York City has a constitutional right to housing as determined in case law. So they spend a lot of money on shelter for homeless people. And the idea was that maybe they could save some money if they kept people in their apartments. So that would be, if any piece of that right to counsel bill survived, even a pilot, that could be really important for a lot of low-income tenants, but it's an astronomical cost given our perpetual state of fiscal crisis here in the state of Connecticut.
Aaron and Anika, I want to thank you both very much for sharing so much with us. We've had unfortunately a really condensed amount of time, and we could certainly get in to a lot more. My hope is that we'll have a chance to really dig into some of this even more in our small groups. And I think Betty Ann is going to sort of walk us through the process or explain to us how we're going to get into our small groups. But I do want to say thank you both very much for all of the insightful comments and information that you've both shared.
Yes, thank you very much. As usual, we never have enough time for the presentation because you both are so knowledgeable and we appreciate your helping us become more educated. All these bills and books and links that we've discussed tonight will combine and share with everyone who's on the call, so you can do some follow-up and review all that. Right now, though, we do want to take about 15 or 20 minutes to go to some small group discussion, and Kayla Rose is going to put us in the small groups. There will be someone in your group that has been designated as a facilitator. It's mostly members of the steering committee who have offered to take that role, but I put the questions or suggested questions in the chat. There are 3 suggested questions, and your group can go with those or go on another direction if you want to kind of think back over this conversation. And then we'll come back together about 7:20, and we'll have a few minutes to hear back from some of the groups, some of the highlights or high-level conversations that you had before Terry wraps us up for the night. Well, welcome back, everyone. Sometimes I feel like it's a rush through the program, but we know your time is valuable, and an hour and a half is a long time for many people to be on a Zoom call in the evening. So thank you for bearing with us as we tried to do a little bit of everything. I know our small group had great conversation around some of the information the presenters provided and some thoughts and ideas that individuals had from our own group. But I want to ask any group that wants to share a few thoughts or comments from their small group discussion. I may see you waving your hand, or you may unmute and jump right in, but we would love to hear from some of the groups.
Betty Ann, Bob White. I think we had a very good discussion, short though it may have been. We were very fortunate to have Annika with us, and we talked a little bit about what Catalyst members could do at affordable housing zoning hearings in their own town. And, that is difficult. And Annika shared with us just how frustrating it is to go there. And once you're at a hearing, according to her, you've lost. And she put a lot of hope in the bill that would try to make affordable housing as right, so you could avoid those kinds of hearings. And one of our members had a great idea at the end that on the notion of crises are a bad thing to waste is we're going to have a lot of empty office buildings in Hartford that could be repurposed. And people can feel what they want to feel about affordable housing, but economics rules. And if that's what you need to make something back, then that helps. So I thought it was very productive. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Bob. Who else would like to share some comments from their group? Amy?
Sure, thank you. We talked a little bit about how it was unfortunate that the transit-oriented development provision was lost from one of the bills that progressed, and how in the suburbs it would be challenging for folks, even if they could afford to get here and there were homes, the lack of transit really creates a challenge for people to get to work if they don't work in town, and that is an unfortunate provision that we would hope could be looked at. Other solutions could be looked at. We talked about how this is a really sort of concentrated issue that's been going on for a long time, how it's systemic, but that and then we sort of wrapped up our conversation around how do we incentivize towns that don't carry their share of affordable housing to take on more. And Chris talked a little bit about some work from the foundation and educating those communities about why things like the ADUs, that the accessory dwelling units, could be good for young people, could be good for generating new income in town, and but so that other towns are learning about why this could be good for them personally, but also economically for the region in terms of these different types of housing. So we had a really great conversation. We're so grateful for for Erin and Annika's sharing just so many incredible resources, and know that it's a big job that we have to do.
Thank you, Amy. Anyone else want to share from their group? Wendy?
Myself.
There you
One
are.
thing we became aware of is that there were only 4 of us together, but each of us was aware that there are citizen groups that are developing and working to broaden the education of the membership of their towns when it comes to the importance of diversity. For instance, Hebron has a group that is really pushing hard to educate their population, which is highly restricted in terms of zoning and apartments, or they don't even have, it's all single family homes. And they're working very hard to increase the level of diversity in education. And we all realized that there's been a tendency for towns to, when properties become available, they snap it up as being used for open space rather than for affordable housing. It was very, very enlightened sharing that we did together.
That's a good word for it. I like enlightened sharing. We have time for 1 or 2 more comments if anyone else would like to share. Amanda?
Thank you. We also had a great conversation. We touched on a number of different issues, but one of the things that bubbled to the surface about next steps that we can all start taking are things that are similar to, the education that we can do in small groups in our own communities, since the foundation, does represent 29 different towns, as do many of the Catalyst members. So there's an organization in Hamden called Spring Forward that offers a good model for what they're trying to do in their community. But one of the things, we had Erin in our group, which was a real feather in the cap for our learning. And one of the things that she mentioned to us was that the people who, there's obviously a lot of people writing in about negative things that have to do with housing, but the people who are actually showing up in person and putting their own face and voice to this, those people are generally the people who are speaking in favor of things. So that number, the visibility of people in favor of the issues coming forward has been very helpful, and that you tend to see the opposition doing things in writing. So that's something to keep in mind as we choose whom to highlight.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Oh wait, anyone else want to share? I don't, yes, Carol?
Hi, as Amanda mentioned, we talked about some of the different communities, the opportunities they have. It would be really nice to know what is available. Like, I live in West Hartford. I'm not sure how to even look for something that might be an opportunity to have a conversation, and or in any of the neighboring towns. So if there's any way that we could get if there'd be a way of compiling the groups in the various towns. Somebody mentioned Glastonbury as well. And so it'd be really nice to have that information. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
If you want to reach out to me, I have some information I can share with you, Caroline.
And we will include a lot of these links in a follow-up email to everyone who's on tonight too. I'll also take this opportunity to remind you that we do keep a kind of a running tally of articles of interest on the Catalyst 2021 web page on the HFPG site. So if you come across things, please share them with me so I can post them there and we can make them available to the community. Also, we've started a Giving Circles page on Facebook for all members of all 3 of our Giving Circles. But I encourage you, if you're on Facebook, to join that page. And it's another place we can link information for everyone. So I think at this point, I'm going to thank everyone for being here and especially thank our speakers. But I'm going to turn it back over to Terry, our steering committee chair, to wrap up the program.
And I'm going to try to do that fairly quickly. First and foremost, thank you to our presenters, Erin and Anika and Michael, for your leadership. I would remind all of us Catalyst members that our next gathering like this will be on June 29th. So please mark your calendars now. I particularly want to thank those of us here tonight that are guests, that are not members of Catalyst Fund yet, but remember that the first year of Catalyst Fund membership is half price. So for the very first year, if you join with us, it's only $250 to join. After that, it's $500 a year to be a member. But that first year, because we want to invite you in, it's half price, and we hope that you're willing and to follow up, because this is one important way to make a mark. And also, as we learned, I think tonight, as we always do, this is a fascinating educational experience for all of us who are Catalyst Fund members. We learned so much by participating in this. And so thank you, ultimately, thank you to Betty Ann and your crew, to Abigail and to Kayla and Chris and all of you who have helped put this together for us this evening. This was certainly eye-opening and heart-wrenching at the same time for us. And we look forward to seeing everybody and more on the 29th. Thank you all.